My name is Mike Kuzma. For those of you who don't know me, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out to Burning Books. Today we have a special guest all the way from the New York City area, Rachel Wolkenstein. And I'll be brief. I actually met Rachel through her dad, Ed, who used to head up the Committee to Free Mumia. And that's how I first learned about Mumia's case. And then through my dealings with Ed, I learned that his daughter actually represented Mumia. So I thought it would be great, and Rachel's been gracious, was gracious enough to travel to Buffalo. She went to UB Law School, and I don't know, is there anything like that?
That's fine.
Actually, so she is familiar, so there's Buffalo links here. We have a lot of attorneys who come out of Buffalo and have gone on to do bigger and better things, Rachel being one of those attorneys. But without further ado, I'll introduce my dear friend and comrade, Rachel Wolkenstein, fellow Buffalonian.
It is totally appropriate to be speaking about Mumia Abu-Jamal's case in this bookstore, given the fact that Leslie and the people around this bookstore, Leslie in particular, are under attack for being perceived as, and I think they are, opponents of this government in terms of its politics. And it's a recognition of the fact of the importance of what bookstores actually play in terms of organizing. And when I was in Buffalo, I grew up here. We had Martin Sostry's bookstore in the Lower East Side, and he was brought up on charges dealing with riot and everything that he successfully defeated. And also, I got some of my political start at the People's Bookstore on Main Street, where they organized the Free Angela Davis work. So bookstores and political protests go hand in hand, and of course Mumia's life is all about speaking out against injustice. I just want to start by, before we're going to have a film, which is actually historic in and of itself. I'll tell you that in a second. But, Mumia is somebody who is known as the voice of the voiceless because he spoke out in defense of everyone. He was a black defender of black rights, but he was a defender of Hispanic rights, of the rights of poor people, anyone who was without representation, and against police brutality. And for that, he was targeted from the time he was 15 years old. 15 years old under COINTELPRO that the FBI ran. And they said in his actual files, and I think you'll see this on the film, that despite his young age, we believe he should be under daily surveillance because he speaks out. He uses his voice. So this film was made in 1990 by the organization I was with for about 25 years called the Partisan Defense Committee. That is actually the organization that began the first international campaign for Mumia back in the late 80s. And in fact, I first met Mumia in 1987, a long time ago, in prison. And this was a film, the interview that was done of him, in which he gave to the PDC to begin publicizing his case. And so it puts together, in the very early days, the political targeting that Mumia faced and why he did and what the circumstances were that led to his arrest. And I will speak when this is over with. It's about a 25-minute film which deals with just the very rudiments of the trial, and I will deal with more of why this is a political frame-up, why an innocent man was targeted, and go through some of the details because, let me assess you, how many of you are familiar with Mumia's case? Little bit. Okay. How many of you feel like you're really conversant in the facts of his case? Not so much, right? Okay, a few people, great. So I will tell you, I'm sure, facts that you don't know about the case and why that is, but we'll deal with that a little bit. I think you'll find this video very interesting. It's come off of YouTube, so it's a few generations behind, and it was made a while ago. Technology was a little different. Okay, 1990 it was made. There's another 15 minutes, which later on, if people want to look at, we can do, which deals with sort of the trial. which is very interesting for what we knew at the time, but it's also very outdated because there's so much more that we've learned over the past 15 years. This was made in 1990. And as I said, I had met Mumia just a couple of years before, and there really had been no investigation on the case. There had been no work done. His case had barely, at the time this was made, had actually only just gone to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, in which the court refused to hear any of the like 15 different issues he had on appeal at that time. Just totally shut it down entirely. And you can see from what's graphically here how well known Mumia was at the time. When he arrived on that street, at the time that police officer Daniel Faulkner was shot and killed, it was close to 4 a.m. in the morning on a Tuesday morning. It was a red light district in Philadelphia, Center City area, unknown to Mumia at the time, and unknown to most anybody at the time. It was also the center point of 3 federal investigations into police corruption that were ongoing at the time, looking into the relationship of Philadelphia police with the mob, dealing with after-hours clubs, illegal gambling, prostitution, and drug dealing, and all of that. And this was unknown to anybody at the time. It came after the period of time when you saw what had happened to Delbert Africa and the MOVE organization, and the earlier thing, Powelton Village. That was actually a year-long siege. Year-long, this house was totally barricaded in an attempt to really starve them out. And Mumia covered that during that whole period of time and was very, very visibly known. When Mumia was there at the scene, arrived at the scene that night and saw his brother and ran to the scene, what happened there is it was really an attempt to execute him. And what he said at the time, one of the many things he said at the time, it was there in the film, is my only crime is that I survived. Because the police had been looking for an opportunity to both frame him up, as what they did with the Panthers across the country, shooting the Panthers, killing them, and it was an opportunity that they took. Not set up at the time, but an opportunity because all the police on the scene knew exactly who Mumia was. They were largely stakeout police officers. The same police officers who arrived at the scene of that shooting were the same police officers that were involved in the blockade against the MOVE organization that was led by the stakeout squad. In Philadelphia is their SHOT teams, it's their SWAT team, the same people called a different name. They were the same people who were in the forefront of the charges against the charges on the Panther headquarters at the time. At this period of time, in 1981, was less than 10 years from Mumia being a teenager, 15 years old, 16 years old, being actually the voice and the face of the Black Panther Party in Philadelphia. In that very short period of 10 years, he went from being an activist in student struggles and for Black history, Black rights, Panthers, to being a very, very well-known journalist. He actually became a radio journalist of some renown in this very short period of time. He has a beautiful voice, as you can hear. It was actually thought of at the time that if any Black person was going to make national news, it was going to be Mumia Abu-Jamal. And it's very hard to understand how well known he was if you were not from that area, and taking into account all the propaganda that's happened in the past over 30 years that says from the prosecution side he was there on the scene, it was his gun, there was a confession, there are all these eyewitnesses, when in fact, as you can see from the Philly Inquirer front page, that Philly Inquirer is like the New York Times, or Buffalo Evening News, better than the Buffalo Evening News. It's like the major mainstream, newspaper, and its headline, if you just think about it, here's a guy that's accused of killing a cop, and the headline is eloquent, journalist, not afraid to raise his voice. People were absolutely shocked. And some years later, in talking and reading from the interview with the DA who actually tried the case, it said it was actually considered a miracle in police circles that he was actually able to get this conviction. I say this because I want to break down a bit this whole view of the case that had developed for a long time. And I know I'm not speaking to those people in this room, but you have heard this, I'm sure, for so long. Mumia himself wrote an affidavit finally in 2001. He had spoken out about his case early on when he was first arrested. He advocated for his innocence. He brought police brutality charges against the police immediately because they tried to kill him. They shot him on the street. He was shot through his lungs to his liver. He was critically wounded. The police originally didn't want to take him to the hospital. They originally were going to take him to police headquarters, and it took 45 minutes before he got to the hospital. He was beaten by at least a half a dozen cops who arrived immediately on the scene, beaten again by the inspector who was in fact the architect of the frame-up, which I'll explain more, in the van. And then he was beaten in the hospital by police. Cops came into the room where he had his tubes and stuff and standing on and all this. So when he says, my only crime is that I survived, it comes from a position of having been targeted by the FBI and the police from the time he was a young teenager, 15 years old, until the time that they got him on the street and they did that to him. He asked for a lineup immediately, too, because he knew that there were other people that ran from the scene, that he could not have been identified at all as the actual shooter. At that time, he demanded a lineup. He was not given a lineup. And of course, he made the point that he was innocent. So I just want to begin with saying that the police in the prosecution's case was very tight at the time from the beginning. They said that they found his gun immediately, and the police officer's gun, by the two cops who arrived first on the scene. This was all within about 40 seconds from the time that the police officer, Daniel Faulkner, called in on a radio run saying, send me a van, send me a car. I made a stop at 13th and Locust, which is in this Center City area, and then immediately afterwards, on second thought, send me a van, which means actually that he was going to make an arrest, and it was quite likely that there was somebody else was there. The prosecution's case was based on the fact that it was as if nobody else was around except for Mumia, his brother, who was driving the car that was being stopped, and then Mumia, who comes across the parking lot. He had been driving a cab. He had lost a lot of his radio journalism jobs because he was viewed as being biased towards MOVE. And this was an area where the clubs were getting out. These after-hours clubs were all getting out, and he was picking up a fare. And as he wrote in his affidavit, he said, I did not shoot police officer Faulkner. I had nothing to do with the killing of Officer Faulkner. I'm innocent. I was filling out my log when I heard some shouting. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a flashing dome light of a police cruiser. That wasn't unusual. I continued to fill out my trip sheet when I heard what sounded like gunshots. I looked again into my rearview mirror and saw people running up and down Locust Street. I recognized my brother standing in the street, staggering and dizzy. I immediately exited the cab and ran to the screen. I came across the street. I saw a uniformed cop turn toward me, gun in hand, saw a flash, and went down to my knees. And that's all he knows, because he was critically injured and then beaten. Now, there were, as I said, there was this call-in on the radio runs, and within 40 seconds, according to the trial testimony, the first police officers say they were there. The radio runs show it was about a minute and a half. Within 2.5 minutes, the scene was flooded with police officers. Some 15 police officers were there in 9 cars, 2.5 minutes after Officer Faulkner called in this call. At least 3 of them were white shirts, meaning commanding officers. One has to ask why that was. It's also the truth, according to their own records, this is all police records, that at least 9 of these police officers were already on the way to the scene before it was ever reported that Faulkner was shot. These all raise substantial questions over what was happening that night. Now, one of the first officers to arrive was Inspector Alfonso Giordano, and he took control of the scene that was there. According to what he said at pretrial hearings and what was on in the newspapers and front page types of headlines, is that according to him, he went into the van where Mumia had already been thrown after he had been beaten, and he said that he saw Mumia had a shoulder holster. Mumia did have a registered weapon that he had bought some years before, and he was carrying it because he had been attempted to be robbed and driving his taxi a few weeks before this. Giordano says to Mumia, "Hey, I see you have a holster here. Where's your gun?" And according to Giordano, Mumia said, "Oh, my gun's on the street where I threw it after I shot the cop." That's what he said at the preliminary hearing and at the bail hearing. And in other words, Mumia was so well thought of, he actually was granted bail originally. He was granted bail on a murder case like this when doing the stuff, and then it was revoked a few days later. That's what Giordano said. He was the chief prosecution witness in the very beginning period of the time, Now, Giordano was also the cop who said that there was a taxi cab driver parked right behind the police car. So if you remember briefly from there was the Volkswagen with the broken bumper that was stopped. That was Billy Cook, Mumia's brother's car. And then you had police officer Faulkner's car, and he was driving alone that night. And then you had supposedly Robert Chobert's, who's a taxi cab driver, parked behind, and he says that he saw Mumia shoot the cop. This is all prosecution witnesses. Prostitute Cynthia White said that she was on the street corner and she saw Mumia shoot the cop. And the shooting wasn't just like a shooting. The prosecution story was that the witnesses said that Mumia stood astride over the cop like this and bent down and shot him down at his head. 4 shots going off, one of them hitting Faulkner between the eyes, and the other one is like hitting the sidewalk. An execution type style, very brutal, very conscious. That was their position. Giordano was responsible for Cynthia White, Chobert, and identifying Mumia's gun as being on the sidewalk, as being right there. So he's like the linchpin of all of these different witnesses and doing the stuff. So the prosecution's case is totally falsified. I'm only looking at these notes because I could go on for 3 hours, and I'm trying to keep it shorter here. And what happened is what happened with each of these witnesses is they were each either weren't there and lied because they were under threats and harassment or given promises by the police, or innocence of Mumia was also falsified, was suppressed. So you have manufactured evidence and suppression of evidence of Mumia's innocence. Chobert was a young guy. He was about 21 years old. He was on probation at the time because he had been convicted of throwing a firebomb, a Molotov cocktail, into a schoolyard while school was going on. He paid to do it. And he was one of the primary prosecution witnesses. Photographs that were taken at the time, within few minutes of the shooting, by an independent freelance photographer named Pedro Polikoff, and also the police photographs do not show Chobert's cab behind him. Chobert was not there. He actually then also admitted to our investigator in 1995 that in fact it was all a lie, and he had been promised by the prosecution that they would make his probation problems go away, because he was also driving with suspended license, doing this other stuff, and they would all go away if he would actually lie and say that Mumia was the shooter. No other witness, prosecution or defense witness, saw Cynthia White, the prostitute with 38 charges, on the scene that night. And in fact, during the testimony in 82, which was when Mumia's trial was, The main defense case was that the actual shooter ran away. And there were some 4 people at the time, prosecution witnesses, one of them being Schobert, who originally in his early statement said he saw somebody run away and then come back like 30 feet, then it became, 30 feet, then it became 3 feet and whatever. One of the witnesses that said they saw the shooter run away was Veronica Jones. She was also a young woman who was on the street working as a prostitute. She had 3 young children. She was at the time 82 of the actual trial. She was in jail, and she was brought from jail on this other charges into the courtroom. The defense expected her to say, which was in her witness statement, that she saw 2 men run away down the street. And instead, she said, no, I didn't see that. I didn't see that at all. I just saw 2 men standing there, which actually consolidated the prosecution's case of saying that Billy Cook and Mumia were both standing there. Veronica Jones' story is right here in a book that I helped work in getting out and wrote an afterword with, and it's available for you to read. And it's a very gripping story of actually what happened to this young woman and how she was pressured. We found her as a witness in '96. She wasn't around. We had big, long hearings in '95. But we knew in '96, from what she told us, that she had been threatened by the police. She was being held on those robbery charges. And then she would be sent away for 5 to 15 years on robbery charges, away from her kids, losing her kids, if she did not identify Mumia as the shooter. Courageously, in '82, when she came to the trial testimony, she went, as Mumia describes it, halfway. She didn't identify Mumia as the shooter, but she did say in the trial, as I said before, that she didn't see anybody run away. And in '96, when she came forward to tell the whole story of what happened to her, including that Cynthia White, the main prosecution witness, that everyone others said wasn't there, that she had been coerced and been threatened and promised favors if she would identify Mumia, Veronica Jones was arrested off the witness stand. It was one of the more dramatic things that you could possibly see. She comes in to tell the truth about police harassment, coercion, what happened to her. Judge Sabo, who was the judge who tried the case and tried the first appeals hearings, threatened her with perjury charges, and when she wouldn't bend, after they went through all these different things against her, petty crimes from this and that when she was younger, to accusing the attorneys of trying to bribe her, and didn't she get money for rent from the attorneys to bribe her for doing this stuff. They brought in police troopers from New Jersey, and they asked her, didn't you get picked up some point for passing a check? And she said, oh, I was never arrested for that. It was nothing. They brought these cops wearing Star Wars uniform, Star Troopers uniforms, into the well of the courtroom, standing right in front of her. And she said, you're not going to make me change my story. I am going to keep to what I have to do. And Judge Sabo basically ordered her to be arrested off the witness stand. And that whole story is here, and it gives you a microcosm in a very graphic way of the type of harassment and everything that witnesses for Mumia were subjected to. And it's there. It also contains an afterword that goes through Mumia's case, looking at it from the perspective of the witnesses and how they fit into the case that I had the privilege of writing. All right, so every witness was harassed like that. There was another witness, one of the people that actually was on the street corner, a man by the name of William Singletary. He was a Vietnam vet, decorated a couple times, a black man, like in his around 25, 26, 27. He had never been arrested. He was a businessman. He had a lot of dealings with cops because he ran a towing company that I think got all the cars that the cops picked up off the road, or stopped people who were driving too fast supposedly and impounded, and they went to his place. So he was a guy who usually had very good working relations with the police, if you get my picture here. And he was there on the street corner. He saw what happened. He saw Mumia arriving after Faulkner was shot. He describes Mumia being beaten up, and he was taken to homicide, to headquarters, after the shooting. And that's clear. It's clear he was there. It's clear he was questioned for many hours. They arranged a police report from another policeman who knew Singletary, who said the only thing in this other policeman's report is, William Singletary was there and he told me he didn't see anything. That's the only that was there as part of the record. Now, Singletary's report, police report that came out that night and that was given to the defense, basically said, I didn't see anything. It was like 4 pages of I didn't see anything. I basically was introduced to him in 1990, and he told us at the time that in fact what really had happened is he was taken to police headquarters, he was threatened with being beaten, he was told his whole business was going to be trashed. If he did not say that, Mumia did the shooting, he was not going to do that. And they basically let him off so long as he kept his mouth shut and just didn't challenge the fact that he was really there and saw what happened. And in fact, his place was trashed. He had to leave Philadelphia. He went out of state. And it was only like years later, in 1990, that he came forward and he said, look, here's what really happened. And we had him on the witness stand in 95. And he told this whole thing. Judge Sabo didn't hear anything of it, found it not believable, and just dismissed it all. The other thing about Cynthia White, we had 2 other witnesses, Pamela Jenkins, another prostitute who came forward we found her in 97, who said that she knew that Cynthia White was afraid for her life with the cops, and that she had been coerced into lying about Mumia. Another woman who wasn't a prostitute but was in jail with Cynthia White at the time in 81, who came forward in 2001, who also said that she was afraid of the cops and she lied for that reason. There were 2 other witnesses. As I said, Chobert wasn't involved, Cynthia White wasn't. They were the 2 main witnesses that said that Mumia did the shooting standing over Faulkner. There were 2 other witnesses that the prosecution brought forward who saw different pieces. One of them was a guy just who saw somebody run across the parking lot. They were all different types of descriptions of their clothes and their hair and everything. And another man who was parked across the intersection, who said that the person who did the shooting had an afro. Mumia had dreads. Mumia's brother had dreads. And couldn't identify whether or not the person he then said he saw on the scene was either Mumia or the driver of the car or somebody else. So these were not really eyewitnesses. All right, so let me talk about the ballistics and Mumia's gun. Mumia did have a gun. He had a gun that was registered to him. That gun was found on the scene. The police, as I indicated before, said they found it, right away when they first got there. The radio runs, which are the communications, radio transmissions between the scene and central command, show nothing at all, report nothing that is similar to the prosecution's case. So for instance, there's no report that Mumia confessed. There's no report that Mumia's gun was found until minute 14. 14 minutes later, it says that, we think we found the gun and we think we have the doer. In fact, minute 5, the police are reporting, we think they have the officer's gun, and we think the officer's gun is gone away, they've left the scene. And supposedly Mumia's gun and Officer Faulkner's gun were found by the same police officer, a few feet from each other. So no report of a confession, no report of finding a gun, no report of any ID by any witnesses in these radio transmissions to Central Command. In terms of the other things with the ballistics, there's no record of any testing being done on Mumia's hands. Nothing. Even though this is standard operating procedure, even though they have a mobile crime team unit that's supposed to come and do that, even though the gun residue that is on your hand will stay there for hours and hours and hours. So theoretically, you can have your hands washed and stuff, and they'll still find it on there. They supposedly did no testing. my presumption is that they did a testing and it came out negative, and that's why there was no testing. There were no fingerprints on the gun. Well, one of the reasons there were no real fingerprints on the gun is in one of these sets of photos that were taken by this independent photographer who was there like 10 minutes after the shooting happened, shows this officer, Forbes, who was one of the early officers there, the guy that says he picked up the gun, carrying the two guns without any gloves, without anything, holding them in his bare hands and carrying them around for several hours. Didn't turn them over to the mobile crime unit to test them, took them to the homicide, et cetera, et cetera. So nothing was done on the guns. But even more dramatically than that, remember I described to you the way the shooting happened, supposedly shooting down at the sidewalk with a .38, at least 3 bullets hitting the sidewalk. Well, if you shoot a .38 down at a sidewalk, you're going to show markings called divots. You're going to show markings, marks of different types of things showing that there was sort of a little explosion there, because that's the power of that gun. And plus, the prosecution said that Mumia had particularly powerful bullets. It had 38 plus P of bullets, which are particularly powerful. That was to show also the intent to kill a cop. And that would have made even stronger markings. There are no markings. These photos have been looked at, since that time by specialists, NASA-trained people looking at, these things. They're totally clean and whatever. So the shooting could not have happened the way the prosecution maintained it. The witnesses could not have seen what the prosecution maintains they had. Nobody could have done it that way, let alone Mumia doing it that way. So you have that. Then you have the whole question of the confession. And remember back, Officer Giordano, he's the inspector. Inspector, by the way, is like the third highest level in the police department in Philadelphia. And he was a very high-level guy. He, as I mentioned before, maybe I didn't hear, he was Rizzo's sidekick. He was involved in all these major things. Did I mention, because I was talking to somebody else beforehand, Giordano was in, should I say this? Stop me if I did. Giordano was in charge of the attacks on the Panthers, right? I said this already. He was in charge of the year-long blockade. Yes, excuse me. Well, can't say it enough. Year-long blockade around the Move house. Okay. It turns out that Giordano was also being investigated as being a corrupt cop at that time. And in fact, not only Giordano, yes?
Did you mean he was number 3, or like was Rizzo whoever the police chief?
No, Rizzo wasn't. At that point, Rizzo was the mayor.
Okay. Yeah.
He was already the mayor by that time.
Or was he the police chief? And then
police chief, deputy chief, and then there were inspectors. And then there were several
right.
inspectors and stuff like that. So he wasn't number 3, but he was the third highest rank. And he was certainly the highest ranking police officer on the scene. He was in charge of whatever happened there and sort of getting stuff together. And I describe him at this point. He was the architect of the frame-up, knowing who Mumia was and putting together the pieces. And, if you're around, 14 minutes is actually a sizable amount of time to say, Cynthia White, we also learned from other witnesses that we had that she did tricks for the cops. I mean, it's sort of like how do you describe a Center City area in Philadelphia, the prostitutes that work that area on a regular basis, they did tricks with the cops all the time. They provided information to the cops. So it'd be sort of like a narc who didn't snort. You know what I mean? If you didn't taste the goods in Center City, you would be suspicious. You would be not playing ball. You wouldn't be able to be trusted. And they used the prostitutes to get other evidence and snitch and do whatever. So the punchline of all this is Giordano, being in the position that he was in, and he testified at all the major things in the papers and everything like that. He never testified at trial. He disappeared. When the trial came, no Giordano. In fact, I think if you would ask 99.99% of the people who think they know Mumia's case, they will not know Giordano's name. What happened is that the FBI and the Justice Department, who were running this federal investigation on the police, corrupt police informed the DA, who happened to be Ed Rendell, and informed Ed Rendell, hey, we have a problem here. We have a collective problem. If Giordano is a witness in this case, it risks messing up this case when it comes out sometime later, and it could come out. And maybe they were concerned about their investigation as well, because they weren't going to tell the defense about this, because Giordano was a very high-level target, and they wanted to pursue that because it was involved with other people as well. So what they did is they pulled Giordano from the case. Giordano was pulled from his position as a command inspector. He was given a desk job in personnel in that spring. Never testified at the trial, as I mentioned, and he retired at full pension pay on the day after Mumia was sentenced to death. First working day after his trial was over. And disappeared from Mumia's case until about 2 years ago, when he became, again, a main spokesman for the FOP on Mumia's case. Now, in terms of what happened to Giordano, he wasn't indicted till 1986. By that time, there had already been indictments of about 40 different cops at very high level. From the first indictments that happened were brought in '83, like in other words, a whole year and a half after Mumia's, or about a year after Mumia's conviction. And they included a man by the name of John DiBenedetto and a man by the name of John Smith. They were the commander and the deputy commander of the Central Police Division, which is the division of which covered this area. So, and an unindicted co-conspirator in this indictment was a man by the name of Carlini, who was the head of homicide. So in other words, the entire police command, chain of command in Mumia's case, from the commissioner to the commander to the deputy commander of the Central Division where the Faulkner shooting took place, the head of homicide division, and Giordano, who was the ranking officer on the scene, were all targeted for on corruption charges. And three of them were named, or two of them were convicted, and the other was an unindicted co-conspirator. In these investigations, it was also clear that there were policemen, uniformed policemen, who were working with the feds, unofficially, and the cops were afraid of that, and they knew about that at affidavits from the main witness in these actual convictions, who was, federal witness and everything, who testified to that, and that Giordano was the main target. He had done, it's just a funny story, he had been asked by one of the guys that had sort of brought him in and was doing these deals with him to actually run a wiretap sweep of Giordano's headquarters, because he also knew about doing these things. And Giordano made a joke, I bet this guy's working for the feds. And it turns out he was working for the feds, and certainly the fact that Giordano was there and doing stuff was reported to the federal government. All right, so back to the trial. Giordano was pulled, and they needed to come up with a confession. They didn't have a confession anymore. So what they came up with, and this is what people familiar with the case know, Mumia confessed, right? That's what the prosecution said. Where did he confess? Not in the street, in the hospital, right? You've heard about the hospital confession. Mumia supposedly blurted out, in the hospital, oh, I shot that motherfucker and I hope he dies, right? Well, that was a total fabrication to actually come up with a confession. When we had our hearings in '95, we brought in a witness, a police officer who was with Mumia from the moment he was taken in that van through the time he went to the hospital, a guy by the name of Gary Wachschel. He had given a police statement on the night, or the morning, December 9th, that said the Negro male made no comments. When the hospital confession came in at the trial, Mumia realized that they really needed Wachschel, and he tried to get Wachschel into the courtroom, and Judge Sable wouldn't let him, even though it said on his police report, no vacations. And the idea was, they said, well, Wachschel's on vacation. they said, well, just call him at home, see if he can come in and testify, because here he made the statement saying Negro male made no comments. And Sable wouldn't have let that happen. In '95, when we called Wakshill to the stand, he said, in fact, he was at home. He was waiting to be called as a witness. He was right there. Yes, he was on vacation, but in fact, he was on vacation, but he knew he had to stay in town until the trial was over. Now, Wakshill also did put a report in some 2 months later, in February, along with another cop named Gary Bell, in which he said he heard this thing, the Negro, I'm sorry, I shot the motherfucker, I hope he dies. And the line was about that, well, why did it take you 2 months to remember that Mumia confessed? I mean, isn't it important? Don't you learn in the police academy if somebody confesses, you need to report that? Isn't that important? And Wakshill said, well, I was so upset that night, I just couldn't remember. And then he said, well, it's only until this minute that I realized it was really important. And, however, what Wakshill did is he said, well, where it came up actually is that we were all meeting. The prosecutor had this round table. We had this round table discussion of all the police witnesses. And we're all sitting there talking to the case, and he's leading us through the case. He used the word leading us through. We were talking about the case. And the prosecutor said, hey, did anyone hear this statement? And then, the hands get raised, and they do that. The other witness they had about the statement was a security guard at the hospital who said she heard the same thing. Only there was no report that night that was given either. And since then, her stepbrother said that she admitted that she had been coerced and promised that she'd maybe get a job as a policeman, which is what she wanted. She never got it, if she would say that this had happened. So there you go, the question of the ballistics, the witnesses, the coercion, the confession. And what you also have here is the entirety of the state prosecutorial apparatus. You have the cops on the scene, you have the actual details of the case being finessed, by the by the police and then by the prosecutor's office, and you have the Justice Department coming in and continuing its job in terms of COINTELPRO, targeting Mumia, going after the MOVE organization, the Black Panther Party, and actually helping to seal the deal on Mumia's conviction. Oh, a couple other things too. One of the things that also came out in '95 is the fact that a man came forward and said, his name was Arnold Howard, and he said that in fact he was picked up early morning, that morning, like around 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and he and a man named Ken Freeman, these men were business partners of Billy Cook, who ran a vending stand in the area. And they were brought down, Freeman and Howard were brought to police headquarters, and they were given tests on their hands to see whether or not there was any residue on their hands. They were put in a lineup, and according to Howard, he said that Freeman was identified. I mean, since then, Howard's told me they were both identified, but that's another story. That's not part of the court record. And the other thing is that Howard learned that the reason he was being picked up in that morning is that a man who became a lieutenant named Edward D'Amato said that he was taking Howard in because Howard's license was found on Faulkner that morning. Now that license, this is testimony in '95, that Howard's license was found on Faulkner. This comes from a police lieutenant. Howard, of course, said the same thing to us, but we have it on the stand from this lieutenant. And that, of course, information was never given to Mumia. It was never given to the defense. It wasn't given to the defense, in '81, '82, and it wasn't given to us in '95 when we had all these hearings. And this, of course, is proof that somebody else was there, at a minimum. It raises the question of who was there and who did the shooting, all of those things. The other thing is in 1989, in various ways, I spoke to a man who was in prison at the time on minimal charges, as these things go. And he told me that he was there that night. And he had witnessed Mumia being beaten, and he witnessed the shooting of Officer Faulkner. And he said at that time that actually the shooting of Faulkner was a planned hit by police and the mob because Faulkner was a problem for them. And at that point in '89, I didn't know that much about Philly history and I did the investigations and stuff like that. But actually, since then, Billy Cook came forward both in '99, well in '95 I wanted him to testify and he was afraid to testify and didn't testify. In '99 he submitted an affidavit and he did another one in 2001 in which he said that Ken Freeman was in the car with him, that Mumia arrived after the shooting, that Mumia didn't do the shooting, and that Freeman had told him afterwards that in fact that Freeman had participated in the shooting and that it was part of a hit. The man I saw in '89.
Who's Freeman, sorry?
Freeman, I'm sorry, I know a lot of names. Ken Freeman is really a lifelong friend of Billy Cook. And Billy Cook's Mumia's brother, who's driving the car. And Freeman also helped run this vending stand that Billy did. He was a business partner of his. Freeman, the story is about a week later, Freeman's stand, the stand that Billy and Freeman had, was burned, and the cops were all laughing. They burned it to the ground. Freeman died, seemingly by police hands, on the night of the move bombing. I mean, he died, said he was a heart attack. He was 32 years old. Not impossible, but whatever. The family and everybody says that he was found, tied up, naked, dumped someplace. Whatever. There's lots more on all this stuff. Now, a couple things that are important is going back to the man who I talked to who said it was a police hit. In 1999, when I investigated and talked to him again, he said, in fact, that he was the person who actually shot the fatal shot and shot Faulkner in the head after he had already been shot in the back by somebody else, his partner. And he signed a confession. He was prepared to testify in court. And that confession, Billy Cook's statement, all this information about other information about Ken Freeman, all that have been presented to court. Those documents and papers are all in court records, submitted in appeals in the state court and in federal court in 2001. And the court will not even listen to them, will not even hear them, will not put these people on the witness stand, and also would not accept Mumia's statement of his innocence. Even though the prosecution had been screaming and yelling for years on
Which court are you talking about?
Both the Pennsylvania Court of Common Pleas, called PCRA, Judge Sabo was already dead.
The main question is, can you go to a higher court to?
It's already gone.
Oh.
Basically, what happened is it was appealed all the way up in the Pennsylvania system to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. They did not allow the hearings to be opened on this basis. In the writ of habeas corpus, there was an amended petition that was filed. The judge wouldn't even hold a hearing. Wouldn't hold a hearing on this, wouldn't hold a hearing on what happened with Veronica Jones. Would not even, even though it said, well, what Judge Sabo said about Veronica Jones as being a liar and all that, well, I don't know if that's really makes sense from just reading the record, but I'm not going to touch what Judge Sabo said. Yeah, I'm not going to overturn it. And so all of these things have been presented in court, but without any recourse at all. And the last thing is about who really did the shooting. The court won't even allow there to be a hearing. One other thing I want to say about some of this other evidentiary stuff, very interestingly from early time, reading through all these reports from different witnesses, including, I want to talk about Arnold Beverly and who's the man who said he did the shooting, as well as Bill Singletary, the businessman who was harassed by the police and all that stuff, said that the shooter had a green army jacket. green like camouflage or army jacket. Some said camouflage, some green army jacket. All this, including two of the cops, including one of the main cops, the guy that said was carrying around the guns, said the shooter was wearing a green army jacket. And another cop who was with this guy Waxel, who accompanied him, said that the shooter wore a green army jacket. And then various other witnesses said the guy had a green army jacket. Well, Billy Cook was wearing a blue Nehru type jacket with big brass buttons, you know, the high collar and all that. Mumia, and I've seen Mumia's clothes in the witness, you know, the evidence room and stuff. Mumia was wearing a quilted ski jacket that was like blue, like a brightish blue, with red sort of zigzag, like lightning stripes up front, not to be confused with a green army jacket. So who was wearing the green army jacket? Now, Beverly says he was wearing a green army jacket. Ken Freeman, according to some, was wearing a green army jacket. Somebody was wearing a green army jacket that was involved in the shooting, and it wasn't Mumia and it wasn't his brother. Okay, so what's the point of all this? The point of all this is Mumia was framed up, that he's an innocent man, that he was targeted for his political beliefs. But there's other stories about this too. It also, in every possible way, Mumia's case exposes everything about the capitalist injustice system. I mean, in long and short, it's about people who are targeted for their political beliefs, of which you have, you know, right here in this room. You have a corrupt system that frames up even people who are guilty, because the whole system is frame up, meaning cops will frame up anyone, will invent evidence. I have another client that I'm dealing with right now, totally not political at all, totally framed up in every possible way because they simply want to get somebody for something, to make that particular collar or to, you know, exchange for something else going on, want to go after somebody else. So it's a frame-up system. It's also corrupt in every way because the relationship between the politicals, between the judiciary, between the cops on the ground, it's everywhere. And that's shown also by the way his case has been handled through the appeals, and somebody like Ed Rendell, who I've barely mentioned. But Ed Rendell went on, he was DA at the age of 32. Well, before he was a DA, he was in charge of the homicide department in the Philadelphia PD's office. And the homicide division was exposed in a Pulitzer Prize-winning news set of articles called The Homicide Squad, which exposed the fact that the Philadelphia homicide cops, with the assistance of the homicide prosecutors, exacted confessions from a huge number of defendants, so many that about 80 of them over the course of 4 or 5 years were reversed by a court. That's how bad they were. I mean, that didn't mean they were other, but and they were written up in this way. Rendell was the DA in charge of homicide. Then he became the head of the DA. He was the DA that got the false warrants against Move and all these different things. He was the DA at the time. When you saw Rizzo up there, Rizzo at that moment in '78 was the police commissioner. Standing next to him, which I don't have in that clip, was Rendell. And what Rendell was saying at that point was, you know what, the cops acted with perfect restraint. If it was in their right and reason to have killed everybody in that house. I mean, so this, and then he went on to become the mayor, became the governor. He is one of the heads of the, you know, one of the head honchos in the Democratic National Committee. He was on the short list to become VP a few years ago, et cetera, et cetera. Huh?
He's Democrat.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, my point is the Democrats are no better than the Republicans. In fact, they can sometimes do more damage, like Obama does, because of the fact that he can get away with it. He does do it. So that's, we could talk about that if people have disagreements. I'm happy to have that discussion. Okay, I want to just make 2 other points. Well, I have a couple other points. Something in general, if I can do that. I know I'm going on for a long time. Okay, I have 2 points I make about the judicial system in general, most times when I talk. One is about the racist, the underlying racist nature of it, which is the legacy of slavery in this country. That's where it comes from. It's that the whole thing, this country was built on slave labor, and the whole fight over slavery and is absolutely critical. And the legacy of slavery exists all over the place. So one of them is a case, a Supreme Court case that was decided in 1986 called McCleskey versus Kemp. And the McCleskey case was brought by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to challenge the death penalty on the grounds that it is unfairly, racially discriminatory in the way it's applied. And they did tremendous amount of statistical research that showed if you were a black man accused of killing a white man, you had 4 times the chance of getting the death penalty than a black man killing a black man. Certainly a white man killing a black man, that didn't even happen. And it was clear, absolutely clear, in terms of the disparity on totally racial grounds. The decision of the Supreme Court was basically this. Well, one, they did not overturn the conviction, and McCleskey was executed. On the general level, what they said is, your documentation is correct, but if we were to grant you this, we would have to overturn the entirety of the American criminal legal system, because in every single aspect, that racial disparity exists. And so they found that the evidence wasn't relevant, because it was so relevant that it cut to the core of the whole way the American legal system works. My other point I like to do is to quote from Anatole France, who I don't know enough about, but he said the most wonderful thing, and it's about class and law. And it's about the law in its infinite majesty treats the rich and poor the same. The rich, just like the poor, are forbidden from sleeping under bridges. And stealing bread, right? It goes on and stuff like that. Thank you very much, right? It's a much bigger quote. But that's the point. So that's the nature of class. And that's a very short microcosm, 2 things about the American legal system that affects everything that happens every single day. All right, last update on Mumia's case. So presumably you all know that after 30 years of trying to have this man executed, the state finally gave up in December 2011. They threw in the towel in trying to get a new death penalty hearing, to try and get a death sentence for him. And they conceded that it was okay for him to rot in jail for the rest of his life on what he calls slow death row. It is good that he's not facing death, there's no question about it, but it is a total outrage that he remains in prison. It's an outrage that he was ever arrested, convicted, or anything. So his situation right now is that's what he's in. He's in life imprisonment. He's got a challenge to the life imprisonment pending in court, which will not go anywhere, I unfortunately promise you. And he is still fighting to get out. The attempt is to get him home, but it really requires an understanding that the only way to get this man out of prison is for there be, to use other people's words, an uncompromising fight to recognize that this case represents everything that goes on in this country in terms of criminal justice system and a million other things like that. And they will not let him go unless it's a fight that recognizes that every aspect of the legal system is against people who fight like this, and has to be fought, recognizing that we need to do everything in the courts that one can, but the only thing is going to be mass organization. And if there was a trade union movement that existed today, it would be based on the trade union movement and organizing power of labor in connection with, immigrants, with minorities, with people unemployed, with everybody who recognizes that this man, who you heard speak in 1990, he has the same political positions now as he had then. In fact, some ways even stronger, I would say. And that what has won people to him in the past, when there were millions of people, or ostensibly millions of people, if you take into account all the organizations that were on record for him, they came because he spoke to their needs, spoke to what people felt in terms of the oppression, the repression, the injustices, the inequities, the war, the hunger, all over the world. And those are the people that need to be mobilized and come forward for him. No reliance on any judge, no reliance on, a politician, whether they be, you know, white, green, brown, black, whatever. It has to be a strong fight to get him free. All right, so thank you very much for listening and questions.